Good day, and welcome to the next module, Integrated Economics into Conservation Planning. My name is Brian Kerwin. I am the Central National Technical Center economist. I have been with USDA for nearly 25 years. I spent 14 years with Extension Service and some other work before return to USDA. My educational background, I have a bachelor's and master's in agriculture and economics, and I have a master's of business administration. Assisting me today in this module presentation is my good friend and professional colleague, Dr. Gary Schnitke of the University of Illinois. Gary?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'm a professor of agricultural economics at the University of Illinois. Been here since 1998, and Brian and I were acquainted almost immediately after I got here. I work in areas related to risk management, farm profitability, crop insurance, and machinery management, and have recently been more and more focused on conservation practices through precision conservation management. Today we're going to talk about economics of farm operation, and Brian, tell us what we're going to be doing here.
Well, there's a lot of different things that enter into this discussion, and we're going to look at four very specific factors as we look at conservation planning. We want to look at, when we're looking at the farm operation, are we talking about animal husbandry or livestock operations? That being perhaps combined or completely separate from, are they cropland type operations? We're going to talk also about, during the module, enterprise budgets. We need to understand the budget and the budgeting concepts to be able to understand how they apply to planning and how they may apply to producer or owner adoption of different conservation practices. And then lastly, we're also going to talk about markets and risk management and how all of this comes together as part of the planning process. When we're talking about animal husbandry or livestock operations, one of the things that you should be looking at as part of the planning process is just looking at the size and the scale of the livestock part of the operation. There's livestock that are found clear across the United States. We'll find cattle operations, swine operations, specialty livestock type operations. But what we also need to be considering, in addition to the type, how are they raised? Is it a very intensive type livestock operation where perhaps that they're raised in confinement system or specialized barns? Are we talking about pasture settings, some type of combination system? People say, why is this important? It's because of the amount of time, and it's the management and the labor requirements for taking care of that livestock. And it is not quick. It is not easy when we're dealing with these types of things. You have to be asking yourself as a planner, if they have their time and their capital tied up with this, how does it affect other duties within the farm? Do they have crops that they take care of? Do they have any other side operations? How do all of these things fit together? When we look at this and those time and capital commitments, we have to ask ourselves how this potentially could affect conservation plans, conservation practices that we might be able to adopt in a given setting. It's a constant interaction. It has to be dealt with. Very much the same questions can be asked of cropland that can be asked of livestock. What is the size and scale? Is it one where we have a lot of different grains? Or is it very conventional, one or two crops? Are we talking about specialty production? There are a number of, again, interacting factors. Is there any side businesses? It's often found to be able to, especially in parts of the Midwest where a producer or owner may have, say, a side business such as trucking or doing some excavation work. Where all these things interact again is the duties and the time and the capital requirements that these take within their primary operation and the effect that this can have on potential plans and adoption of conservation as time progresses. How can we get a better handle on this? How can we be better planners? How can we be better conservationists? One way we might be able to do that is understanding these budgets a little bit better. What are some of these interactions and uses of capital? What are some of the potential conflicts? For you as a ready reference, as a Natural Resource Conservation Service employee, you should be able to find these budgets listed within Section 1 of the Field Office Tech Guide. A enterprise budget provides a detailed accounting of the associated revenues and expenses within a farm. Typically, these budgets that we use and are published within the FODHOG are developed by our sister agency, the Extension Service, that are found within the land-grant colleges in the United States. That they are typically available for what is the most predominant production type in a given state or region. You typically won't find for every crop or every livestock type. If you are in Illinois, you may not find an enterprise budget for carrot or vegetable production, but you would very likely find one for corn and soybean production. And in today's examples that we're going to be working through, we're using Illinois as an example because this is where we're recording from today. And Dr. Schnittke is a member of the faculty here at the University of Illinois.
Yeah, and what we're going to do now is give you an example of the budgets that are produced by the University of Illinois. So this would be an example of an enterprise budget, and then again, they come from the University of Illinois. If we would go out and go and be in Indiana, Purdue University would have their own sets of budgets. Iowa State would have their own sets of budgets, and so on and so forth. Here in Illinois, we're giving you an example, and this happens to be a 2022 budget. So we're looking at 22 budgets. We do this for corn after soybeans, corn after corn, soybeans after corn, soybeans after soybeans, wheat, and double crop soybeans. When we're doing this, again, we're trying to come up with a per acre, and these budgets all here are listed on a per acre basis. So we're trying to give farmers and others a feel for what it will take to produce corn after soybeans and corn after corn. And if you're looking here, the major difference here is a yield drag between those two budgets. Again, when you're looking at an enterprise budget, you're looking at a unit of production. In this case, it's per acre. For livestock budgets, it would be per animal produced, maybe per 100 pigs produced, but it's important to get those units right. And a enterprise budget lists all revenues, and we list all non-land costs to come up with the operator and land return. So that's our format for our budgets. I want to take you now through the budgets that we have here, and we're going to go first through gross revenue, then direct cost, power cost, and overhead cost. If we're looking at revenue, and this would be pretty typical for all land, crop, enterprise budgets, you have yield, price per bushel. And again, we're looking at budgets here, so we're looking at 2022. So this is next year. We're recording this not in 2022. Most of these budgets are forward-looking, so we don't know what the yield or what the price is going to be. And in fact, those are the two bigger variables that happen to be in crop revenue. We take those, so if we're looking at this corn after soybeans budget, we have a 223 bushel yield. That would be our estimate. If we don't know anything about the year before it happens, that 223 bushels per acre is what we would expect to see acre of high productivity land in central Illinois to produce. And we're coming up with a price estimate of $4.50. At this point in time, we're using futures markets to come up with that, and we'll discuss that later on in this webinar. Those things will vary a lot, and we obviously don't know those when we prepare a budget, but it's important to do so to make some estimates. Crop revenue then is yield times price, and then we have several other types of payments here. ARC and PLC is a commodity title payment. We're expecting those to be zero for this coming year, but if we had some expectation for those to occur, we would be putting those in there. Those commodity title payments generally happen when yields are low or prices are low or some combination of those are low. Most farmers in the Midwest on corn and soybeans, in fact, over 90% of the acres are insured. And if we have low yields or low prices, the farmers will get crop insurance proceeds from that. So we don't have any expectations for those this year. So we have $1,004 of revenue for corn after soybeans. And that would be what we would be looking at, Brian.
Yep, that it would. And so, again, Gary was talking about different revenues that come in. So now we've got the top line, but it's not all just profit. And so as we take the next step forward, let's look at what some of those expenses might look like.
So we in Illinois divide these costs out in direct cost, power cost, and overhead cost. Some other budgets will lay those out differently. Some will use variable cost and fixed cost. Basically the same thing, but different categorization here. Our direct costs include everything that's a input that if you plant the acre and you plant the acre, this is what you're going to put on it. So we have fertilizer, pesticides, seed. So these are fertilizer, obviously, pesticides, and seed. And those three items make up a pretty large chunk of direct cost and total cost for that matter. Drying and storage. In Illinois and most states, you have to dry grain, and so we put in a drying cost there. Storage. Most farmers store grain. They don't sell it immediately, so those would be the cost associated with storing that grain. Crop insurance has a premium associated with it, so we put the premium in there, and so our direct costs are $446 for this corn after soybeans budget. Again, these costs are what most people think of as the cost: fertilizer, pesticides, drying, storage, crop insurance. The other second section of costs that we look at are power costs, which all relate to the machinery. Here we have categories for machine hire, which is the hiring of machinery work that is done on the farm. A lot of this in Illinois is for pesticide application and fertilizer application. Utilities are those related to dryers, etc. on a farm. Machinery repair. So this is typically a big item, and it includes the repair of machinery used in the operation of the farm. Fuel and oil is the fuel and oil fuel used in running the machinery across the farm. Light vehicles, actually trucks, and machinery depreciation is the charge to cover the cost of owning the machinery. So if typically you buy machinery, tractors, combines, and equipment, and they typically last several years, we would divide the cost of them, or the price of the machinery, and divide it by the number of years of life to come up with that machinery depreciation. That is typically a very large number, and here you can see $71. It's almost half of the total power cost associated with the machine. The final category that we have are overhead cost, which would include hired labor. So this would be the labor that the farmer hires to get the crop work done. In the Midwest crop operation, that typically relates to most of it relates to harvesting and drivers, truck drivers, and combine operators at that point in the year. Although we also do see some in the spring work as well. Building repair, building depreciation relate to the grains bins and grain or machinery storages on a farm. Insurance here would be covering all the personal items that a person has, miscellaneous, and then interest, non-land. So this is the charge for interest on the non-land portion of the cost. We then come down, add up all those non-line costs to come up with $677 of non-line cost. Our operator and line return then is $327 per acre. So this operator and land return then is what is left to pay the farmer and the landowner. In Illinois, 60% of the land that is farmed by but is farmed and rented from a landowner that's not farming it. Our grain operations often have 80 to 90% of the land that they farm is owned by someone else, and they would be getting that farmland through either a cash rental arrangement or a share rental arrangement. But the operator and land return here is what is left to pay both the farmer and the landowner. And if we had a cash rent situation, which would be a pretty typical one, we would take that cash rent, and in this case it would be something like $280, $290 per acre. Subtract that from that operator and land return to come up with the return remaining to the farmer. If we bring this all back together again, here we see the 2022 budget, an operator and land return for corn after soybeans, corn after corn, and soybeans. You can see here we have a $439 return for soybean after corn, so that's more profitable than our projection for corn after soybeans, $327 per acre. So in this type of situation, you might see a farmer shading more towards soybeans than for corn, but rotations are also important in making those decisions. If you're looking at these budgets and these conservation planning sort of issues, this is what's left to think about conservation. And if conservation has all cost, we have to begin to think about operator and land return minus cash rents or some other rental arrangement to look and see what's left there, and we'll give some illustrations of that. One important point here, these prices here are $4.50 for corn, $12.35 for soybeans, which is what current expectations would be. That's going to vary. I just want to give you one scenario here where we're looking at lower prices than 214 to 220 averages, $3.73 for corn, $9.90 for soybeans. That happens and everything else remains the same, you can see here operator and land return goes down to $155. So if we were paying cash rent here of $280, we would be losing on that situation. $270 for corn, we would again be in a loss situation. So again, prices matter a lot and matter a great deal in what we're looking at as what's remaining to leave that farming operation and that what is left to look at it and on conservation practices. Partial budgets, very commonly used. Here in a partial budget, we're only looking at those items that change. There, you need less detail than that is required for an enterprise budget. An enterprise budget gives you the feel for the entire operation. We're just looking at the items that change. And you're looking at those with and without conservation practice, typically in your case, and you're only looking at the items that are changing. You're looking at the positive items as the increases or the increases to profitability, negative items, negatives, and you're only going to focus on what changes. And Brian, this is really important to your work. So
it is, and rather than get into a whole lot of detail on it today, just wanted to bring it out there that there's always a lot of questions on that partial budget. It's going to be discussed in later a webinar all on its own. We just, because of the questions we know that arise, wanted to let people know it wasn't a topic that was forgotten about.
Yep, and again, the budgets that you saw previous to this were enterprise budgets, and you will often be doing partial budgets. Markets.
Yes, they're ever present in a producer's mind, and they go up and down and sometimes sideways. That what looks like it should be so easy, they say, well, whatever you do, if you buy low, you sell high, and if you buy high, just sell higher. It sounds so easy, but it's really not quite that simple. Producers can control their marketing to the extent that they can pick a time to sell their product. They may even be able to select which product where they want to sell it and get some slight market differentials. But in old economic jargon, they are price takers and not price makers. They don't get to sit there like you can in a retail establishment and say, I'm going to sell my corn for $9 a bushel if $9 a bushel is not being offered in the marketplace. It's important to understand, for much like budgets, markets are in a continual state of flux. They are not constant. They change every day, that there are different supply and demand factors, different marketing factors, different technical factors that enter into it to help change the direction of the market. We're not going to try and turn you into economists. Just simply understand that these markets exist. They're fluid, and oftentimes it may be helpful in the course of your conservation practice. Plot a range of different prices. We were just talking about budgets a moment ago, and Gary gave a fine example about how drastically they can change. Perhaps doing a little bit of sensitivity analysis and saying that looking at things in a couple of different price parameters may make some very good planning sense.
And again, just this is the range that we've seen. We're currently up here above 10, but we were below 10 in the $9 range. And that's going to make, obviously, a lot of difference on the appetite of farmers for conservation practices, as it's really difficult for them to justify in lower price environments the investment that's required sometimes to make these conservation practices work.
Sure. People ask, well, where do these markets come from? That our markets are... Our agricultural markets, I should say, are based upon the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Group. That's where the futures prices that were mentioned earlier, that they become the parent prices for a number of cash prices. That there can be any number of local cash markets. Perhaps there's a feedlot that someone sells directly into. Perhaps there's a terminal elevator system that they sell into. Perhaps that there's a local biofuels plant that they sell into. That there can be any one of a number of cash markets, but typically the number that guides those markets comes from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Group. Understanding these interactions, and to reemphasize a point that Gary brought up a little bit earlier, when you're looking at down market or declining markets, or even, and they'll last often more than a year. The example that Gary gave earlier, from 2014 to 2020, we were in a declining market environment, and with those declining returns, they tend to lower investment because capital has to be conserved. It is used for more critical functions, that there's less available free capital to upgrade equipment, to institute new conservation practices, to be able to even offer expansion sometimes. That the market and what a producer is able to do and how the changes in the market affects their operation, in essence, perpetual planning in the mind of the operator, as far as the ability to operate their business, the ability to provide for their family, the ability to improve the landscape through conservation.
And these markets are also very critical to risk management. There's two items that typically farmers use in risk management. One is the markets themselves, buying and selling primarily grain in the futures. So they'll use futures contracts, and this is part of the operator's planning, that risk management. Often we're looking at forward sales to protect profits. Again, to bring in those cash and generated cash prices at cash flows at a different point in time, we'll see these farmers selling grain at different points in time. About 50% of the grain that's grown in Illinois and the Midwest, for that matter, is stored, and so they'll sell that at different times. Part of risk management, and often as well to coincide with major capital expense. Those sales also have an impact on savings, which is another part of risk management, and will also impact conservation planning.
So, trying to keep this floating dynamic in mind, we have to ask ourselves, so what are the effects? If we're looking at choosing a conservation plan versus no change, if we're going to use cover crops as our example, to think of it in terms of how does it fit within the operation. What are some of the time considerations that we have to take care of? Is that the time that's done seeding, typically in the Midwest, that is after the crop that is growing is harvested. So we have that seeding time that it takes to be able to institute that cover crop versus some other activity that could be done. Does this mean that they either have to hire it done, or do they need to stop combining to be able to go out and plant that cover crop? We have to keep in mind those time considerations when we're sitting there being a planner. When we're sitting there planning, what are the possible cash flow considerations that, again, that we have to consider the trade-offs? What is the cost of seeding? What is the cost of termination? And how does that compare to the current costs? Are we going to increase costs, hold costs the same, or decrease costs? Again, to go into this, to be able to make a plan for it, we have to evaluate this. We need to be able to write it down and be able to explain and demonstrate what that is. And then we also should be able to be planning and being able to talk about both short-term and long-term effects. For example, the utilization of that cover crop, maybe that means there's 1 or 2 less trips across the field we make. What about some of the non-cash improvements like soil tilth? When it's all said and done, we talk about a budget and we use it this way on purpose. How does it all add up? When we do all of the adding and subtracting, what happens? And how does this affect the operation and the profitability of the owner and the operator?
So we can give an example of this. Let's take corn after soybeans, and it has a return of $300 per acre, operating a land return. We have a cash rent, $275, which is pretty close to the current cash rent. If we subtract those two, we have $25 left over for family living and a whole host of other things. But let's say that we subtract $25 to provide for family living. So that would be remaining zero there. And $25 per acre, if you're thinking of 1,000 acres, which would be pretty small, would be only $25,000 or for the family, and then maybe another 500 would take you up to $35,000. So we're not, that $25 isn't generally would be a large amount. Soybeans after corn has a return of $346, and subtracting the above, we has $46 to work with. If your cover crops have an all-in cost, and that would be, a cost to prepare the soil for whatever you do to make this get ready to plant the cover crops, and probably virtually nothing but the seed and running a planter over it, plus some termination cost. There's not much left for a family return. So you often, if we want to look at getting people to adopt conservation practices, you got to look at that margin there, and if that margin is really small, and those costs, even for cover crops here of $30, that there's going to be a lot of resistance to putting those cover crops down.
Well, to try and tie all of this back together, there are a lot of different many factors to be aware of in bringing conservation into farm operations. We've got capital considerations, time considerations, labor considerations, the type of operation. What about the livestock, things of that nature? You need to understand that these things do all compete. It doesn't necessarily mean it's adversarial, but all those needs have to end up being satisfied to be able to provide for the needs of the family, provide for the needs of the owners and the operators, as well as provide for the needs of the land. When we're trying to put together a good conservation plan and discuss these programs, we're going to take these budgets and say that if we did Project A, this is what it would be. Project B could be something like this. When we're trying to tie all this back together, what we're trying to do is take this economic information and build alternatives. And that is going to be the topic of our next webinar, Developing Alternatives. With that being said, my name is Brian Kerwin, And I very much appreciate you taking time to listen in this today.
And I'm Gary Schnitke, and we'll thank you and see you around the corner.